July 18th, 2016. By noon, the ground in Carter County had already split open, like old pottery left too long in the sun. The irrigation ditches were nothing but dry scars, cutting across fields that used to shimmer green just weeks before. Engines had gone silent. Pumps had stopped. And men who had farmed their whole lives stood at the edge of their land, staring at something they had never seen before. Everything was dying, everything, except one field. At the far end of County Road, 12 past a rusted gate and a leaning wooden fence, a stretch of rice still stood tall. Not struggling, not barely surviving. Green, thick, alive in a way that didn't make sense anymore. That was where they found Ethan Walker. He stood knee-deep in his field, his boots sunk in mud that no one else seemed to have anymore. His shirt clung to his back, soaked through with sweat, but his face was calm. Too calm for a man surrounded by a dying county. Behind him, a black pickup rolled to a stop. Dust settled slowly around it. Daniel Reeves stepped out first. Sunglasses on boots too clean for the kind of ground they were standing on. Behind him came a younger man in a pressed shirt, an agricultural engineer from the state clipboard, already in hand, eyes scanning the field, like it was a problem waiting to be solved. Daniel took one look at Ethan's field, then another. His jaw tightened. "That's not possible," he said, not loudly, but enough for the engineer to hear. The engineer didn't answer. He was already crouching down, touching the soil, rubbing it between his fingers. Still damp. Daniel took off his sunglasses, slowly staring across the green rows that stretched further than they had any right to. "What variety is this?" he asked. Ethan didn't answer right away. He just looked out over his field, as if the answer wasn't something you could give in a single word, because what stood there wasn't supposed to exist anymore. And what nobody standing there knew was that the same seeds growing in that field had once been laughed out of this very county. 8 years earlier, almost to the day, the Carter County Agricultural Fair had drawn one of the biggest crowds it had seen in years. Rows of tents lined the dusty fairgrounds. Banners flapped in the late summer wind. New machines gleamed under polished lights. Hybrid seeds were displayed in neat labeled sacks, each promising higher yield, faster growth, stronger resistance. Progress, they called it. At the center of it all stood Daniel Reeves. Even back then, Daniel knew how to hold a crowd. He spoke with easy confidence, moving from group to group, explaining numbers, projections, profit margins. He didn't sell seeds. He sold certainty. And people listened. 30% higher yield under optimal irrigation. He was saying, holding up a sealed bag of hybrid rice. Consistent growth cycles. Predictable output. That's what modern farming looks like. A few men nodded. Others leaned in closer. "That old stuff your grandfathers used?" Daniel added with a light laugh. "It had its time. But we're not farming like it's 1950 anymore." The crowd chuckled along with him. That was when Ethan Walker stepped forward. He wasn't dressed for attention. Faded jeans, dust on his boots, a plain shirt sleeves rolled just enough to show the sunburn on his forearms. In his hands he carried a small burlap sack. No branding, no label, just something old. Daniel noticed him immediately, but not in the way Ethan might have hoped. "And what do you have there?" Daniel asked, smiling in that polite, practiced way that never quite reached his eyes. Ethan held up the sack slightly. "My grandfather's rice," he said. Quiet, steady, like it didn't need explaining. A few people in the crowd exchanged looks. Daniel tilted his head. "Your grandfather's rice?" Ethan nodded. "It's been in our family for years." There was a pause. Then someone near the back let out a short laugh. Daniel glanced at the sack, then back at Ethan. "You're telling me," he said, voice still calm, but edged now, that while everyone here is investing in tested, optimized hybrid strains, you're planning to plant something with no certification, no data, no guarantee, just because it's old." Ethan didn't react. It held up before he said, "Through dry years, that did it." This time the laughter wasn't just one man. It spread. Dry years. The young engineer, fresh out of college, eager to prove something, stepped in. "Sir, with all due respect, resilience isn't about nostalgia. It's about design. These hybrids are engineered for performance under controlled conditions," Ethan said. The engineer frowned slightly. Daniel raised a hand, as if calming the moment, though there was a hint of amusement in his voice now. "Look," Daniel said. "I appreciate tradition. I really do. But farming isn't about sentiment. It's about efficiency." He gestured toward the rows of branded seed behind him. "You want results. You invest in something that's been improved, something that evolves." Then he nodded toward Ethan's sack. "That is a relic." More laughter. Someone muttered, "Guys trying to farm with museum pieces." Another voice, louder this time. "Might as well plow with a horse while you're at it." The crowd leaned toward Daniel now, toward certainty, toward what made sense. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, not arguing, not defending, just listening. Daniel stepped a little closer, lowering his voice, but not enough that others couldn't hear. "If you're serious about farming," he said, "you should think about adapting. Otherwise," he let the sentence hang, then added with a small shrug, "there are always buyers for land like yours." That landed harder than the laughter. A few heads turned, because everyone knew what that meant. Sell or fall behind. Ethan looked at Daniel for a long second. Then he gave a small nod. Not agreement, not surrender, just acknowledgement. "I'll stick with what I know," he said. And then he turned and walked away. Behind him, the laughter started up again, softer this time, but sharper somehow. And that might have been the end of it, just another stubborn farmer refusing to move with the times. But this story was never really about refusing change. It was about understanding something deeper than most people ever bothered to look for. Because long before that day at the fair, before the laughter, before the drought, before anyone cared what Ethan Walker planted, there had been another man standing in those same fields. Ethan's grandfather, Samuel Walker, had never trusted things that came too easy. Back in 1977, when a dry season had stretched longer than anyone expected, most farmers in Carter County had watched their crops fail one by one. The soil cracked, the water tables dropped, and whatever seeds they had planted simply gave up. But Samuel's fields had held. Not perfectly, not untouched, but they had survived. Ethan had been just a boy, then barely tall enough to see over the rows, following his grandfather through the fields at dawn. He remembered the way Samuel would kneel down, not just looking at the plants, but at the soil itself, pressing it, smelling it as if the land was speaking something only he could hear. This kind, Samuel had once said. Holding a handful of rice grains in his palm, doesn't panic when things get hard. Ethan hadn't understood it then. To him, seeds were just seeds. But Samuel shook his head. Some plants, he said, they grow fast when everything's good. They take what they can as quick as they can. He closed his hand around the grains. But this one, it waits. Ethan looked up at him. Waits for what? Samuel smiled just a little. For when everything else runs out. At the time, it sounded like one of those things old men said. Something poetic, maybe even outdated. But Samuel wasn't a man who spoke without reason. Year after year, he saved the best grains. Not the biggest, not the fastest growing. The ones that lasted. The ones that held on just a little longer than the rest. He planted them again, and again, and again. What he was doing, no one else in the county really paid attention to. They were moving forward. New seeds, new methods, better yields. Samuel just kept selecting, refining, quietly building something no one had a name for. When he passed away, he didn't leave behind much in the way of money. No large savings, no modern equipment, just a small wooden box worn smooth at the edges. Inside it, carefully wrapped, were sacks of seeds and a notebook. Most people would have overlooked it, but Ethan didn't, because by then he had started to understand something his grandfather never said out loud. This wasn't just about farming. And it wasn't just about rice. It was about knowing the difference between something that grows fast and something that lasts. The years that followed that day at the fair didn't prove Ethan right, not at first. If anything, they proved everyone else right. The first season after that humiliation, Ethan planted his grandfather's rice across 12 acres. No hybrid support, no optimized fertilizer program, no engineered irrigation schedule, just the seeds and the old notebook. And when harvest came, the numbers were hard to ignore. His yield was lower, not disastrously low, but enough that people noticed. Still sticking with that antique one, neighbor asked, leaning against his truck as Ethan loaded sacks into the back. Ethan just nodded. The neighbor shook his head, almost pitying. "You're working twice as hard for less," he said. "That's not farming. That's stubbornness." Maybe it was, because the second year wasn't much better, and the third year was worse. A late rain had come at the wrong time. The soil had compacted in ways Ethan didn't expect. His harvest dropped further, and for the first time the numbers didn't just look bad. They felt dangerous. Bills didn't wait for principals. Machinery needed repair. Fuel prices climbed. And slowly, quietly, the pressure began to build. Daniel Reeves noticed. Of course he did. By then, Daniel had expanded far beyond the fairgrounds. His hybrid seeds were planted across most of Carter County. His trucks were everywhere. His name carried weight, and he had a habit of circling back. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in a dull orange glow, a black pickup pulled into Ethan's driveway. Same truck, same clean boots stepping out. Daniel didn't waste time. "I heard your last harvest didn't go well," he said, leaning casually against the truck as if he were discussing the weather. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, not looking at him yet. It was fine. Daniel smiled slightly. Fine doesn't keep a farm running. He let that sit for a moment. Then he reached into his truck and pulled out a folder. Inside papers, numbers, offers. "I can take this land off your hands," he said. "Fair price. Better than fair, actually." Ethan finally looked at him. "You'd do well somewhere else," Daniel added. "Something more stable." There it was again. Not an insult this time. Something quieter, more dangerous. Because it sounded reasonable. Ethan glanced past Daniel out toward his fields. They weren't impressive. Not like the others. Not like the bright uniform rows of hybrid crops stretching across neighboring land. His field looked uneven, alive in a way that wasn't tidy. "I'm not selling," Ethan said. Daniel sighed as if he expected that. "You're holding on to something that doesn't work anymore," he said. "You think there's some hidden value in it, some secret." He shook his head. "There isn't." Then he paused, just long enough to make sure the next words landed. "And when it finally collapses, it won't just take your crop with it." He tapped the folder lightly. "It'll take everything." Daniel left shortly after that, dust rising behind his truck as it disappeared down the road. And for a long time, Ethan stood there, holding that rag in his hands, staring at a future that suddenly felt a lot less certain. Because what Daniel said wasn't entirely wrong. The land was struggling, and Ethan didn't fully understand why. Not yet. That realization came later, in the fourth year. It happened on a morning that didn't seem important at the time. Ethan was going through his grandfather's old notebook again. Not skimming this time, not looking for something obvious, really reading it, page by page. Most of it was messy. Handwritten notes layered over older ones. Observations about seasoned soil conditions, planting times. But then, there were patterns. Things repeated, not instructions. Warnings. Too much water weakens the root. Ethan paused. That didn't make sense. Every modern guide said the opposite. Rice needed water. Consistent water. Controlled flooding. That was the standard. He kept reading. Do not rush early growth. Another contradiction. Faster growth was the goal. Always had been. Then one line. Written darker than the rest, as if Samuel had pressed harder when he wrote it. This kind survives by going deeper, not faster. Ethan leaned back slightly, staring at the page, because suddenly, something didn't add up. He walked outside, crossed his field, and crouched down, pushing his fingers into the soil. Then deeper still. The top layer was dry. That much was obvious, but further down, there was still moisture. Not much, but enough. Ethan sat there for a long time, the notebook open beside him, because what he realized in that moment was that he had been farming this crop the wrong way. Not completely wrong, just not the way it was meant to be grown. Everyone else flooded their fields early, encouraged fast growth, wide roots, shallow systems designed to absorb as much water as possible, as quickly as possible. But this wasn't built for that. This was built to wait, to reach down, to find what others couldn't. But there was something else, something deeper that his grandfather had never fully explained, and it wouldn't become clear until the year everything started to fall apart. By the summer of 2016, the heat didn't come in waves. It settled. Day after day, the temperature climbed past what the forecasts predicted. Clouds stopped forming. Wind carried nothing but dust. The reservoirs dropped first, then the canals, then the wells. Pumps that had run for decades sputtered and died. At first, people weren't worried. Dry spells happened. They always had. But then a week passed, then 2, then 4. And something changed. Fields that had once been perfectly managed began to show cracks. Hybrid crops engineered for high yield under controlled irrigation started to struggle. Leaves curled, color faded, growth stalled. Farmers increased watering schedules, but there was less and less water to give. And still, the crops demanded more. Daniel Reeves held meetings, reassurances. "It's temporary," he said. "We've planned for fluctuations." But even as he spoke, the signs were there. What nobody wanted to admit was that the system they trusted only worked when everything else did. And when it didn't, it failed fast, faster than anything they had ever seen. By mid-July, entire fields had turned brittle, green to yellow, yellow to brown. Machines sat idle at the edges because there was nothing left to harvest. And that was when people started noticing something they couldn't explain. At first, it was just a rumor, a passing comment between neighbors. "Have you seen Walker's field?" Then another. "Doesn't look like the others." And then, curiosity turned into movement. Trucks began driving down County Road 12. Then in groups, because at the very end of that road, past the same rusted gate, there was a field that didn't match the rest of the county anymore. And standing in it was the same man they had laughed at 8 years ago. Still quiet, still steady, still planting the same seeds no one believed in. And now, for the first time, everyone was starting to wonder what he knew that they didn't. By the time the truck stopped coming, there were more people standing at the edge of Ethan Walker's field than anyone had seen in Carter County in years. Farmers, dealers, engineers, men who had spent decades trusting the same system, now staring at something that didn't fit into it. No one spoke at first, because the difference wasn't subtle. Just 10 feet away from Ethan's land, the soil was gray, and brittle plants collapsed into themselves like something drained of life. But on his side, green, not perfect, not untouched, but alive in a way that shouldn't have been possible anymore. Daniel Reeves stood at the front of the crowd, arms crossed, jaw tight. He had taken off his sunglasses again, like he needed to be absolutely sure his eyes weren't lying to him. The young engineer stepped forward first. "There has to be an explanation," he said, more to himself than anyone else. He crouched down, pushing his hand into the soil, just like he had earlier that day. Then deeper, his expression changed. "Moisture," he said. Daniel frowned. "That's not possible. The water table dropped weeks ago." The engineer shook his head slowly. "It's not near the surface, but it's there." A murmur moved through the crowd. Daniel turned toward Ethan. "What are you doing differently?" he asked, his voice sharper now. Ethan stood there quiet as always. "Nothing new," he said. That answer didn't help. In fact, it made things worse, because nothing new shouldn't be winning. Daniel stepped into the field without asking. His boots sank slightly into the mud. That alone made a few people shift uncomfortably. He grabbed one of the plants and pulled. The roots came up slowly, dragging soil with them. And that was when everything changed. Because what came out of the ground didn't look like anything they were used to seeing. The root system wasn't wide and shallow like hybrid crops. It was deep, unnaturally deep, thick strands reaching down like fingers, searching for something far below the surface. The engineer stepped closer, eyes locked on the exposed roots. "That's..." He paused, recalculating everything he thought he knew. That's at least 30% deeper than standard root systems. No one laughed this time. Daniel didn't say anything. He just stared, because for the first time since anyone could remember, he didn't have an immediate answer. Ethan knelt down beside the plant, brushing dirt gently from the roots, almost like he was handling something fragile. "It doesn't rush," he said. The crowd leaned in. "It doesn't take everything at once," he continued. "It goes down first. Takes longer." He looked up slightly, but when there's nothing left on the surface, he let the words settle. "It's still reaching." Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Because now it made sense. And at the same time, it didn't. Daniel straightened up. That doesn't explain everything he said quickly, trying to regain control of the moment. Depth alone isn't enough to sustain a full crop under these conditions. He turned to the engineer, almost demanding agreement. "Right." The engineer hesitated, and that hesitation was louder than any answer, because there was something else. Something none of them had accounted for, and it showed itself a few days later. The heat peaked, harder than before, a wave that pushed everything past its limit. What little remained of the hybrid fields gave up, completely. Leaves shriveled, stalks collapsed. Fields that once promised record yields turned into dry, brittle wastelands. Men didn't even bother walking them anymore. There was nothing left to check, nothing left to save. But Ethan's field held, not unchanged. Some edges yellowed, some sections thinner than others, but the core of it stayed standing. And that was the moment nobody forgot, because it wasn't theory anymore. It wasn't speculation. It was visible, undeniable, the kind of proof that doesn't need explaining. People gathered again, not out of curiosity this time, out of something closer to disbelief. And Daniel was there, standing in the same place, looking at the same field, but not the same man. Because now, he wasn't looking down at Ethan Walker. He was trying to understand him. "How long?" Daniel finally asked. Ethan didn't pretend not to understand. "How long have you known?" Daniel clarified. Ethan thought about it for a moment, then gave the only honest answer he had. "I didn't," he said. A few people shifted, confused. Ethan glanced out across the field. "My grandfather did." That name lingered, because suddenly this wasn't about a stubborn farmer anymore. It was about something that had been there long before any of them paid attention. Daniel let out a quiet breath. Then, for the first time in years, he didn't argue. He didn't laugh. He didn't try to sell anything. He just stood there and said nothing. The aftermath didn't come all at once. It moved slowly, like everything else that mattered. At first it was just questions. Farmers showing up early in the morning, hats in their hands, asking about the seeds, about the soil, about the way Ethan planted. He didn't give long explanations, didn't turn it into something complicated. "It takes time," he would say. That's all. Some didn't like that answer. They wanted certainty, numbers, guarantees, the same things Daniel used to offer. But others, they stayed. They watched. And eventually, they tried. The next season, a few fields changed. Not many, just enough to notice. Then more the year after, not abandoning everything new, but bringing something old back into the soil. Daniel's business didn't collapse overnight, but something shifted. Trust. The kind that takes years to build, and only one moment to crack. The engineer came back too, not with a clipboard this time. Just questions, real ones. And Ethan answered what he could, left the rest to the land. By the time the rains finally returned, Carter County didn't look the same anymore. Not because everything changed, but because people started looking at things differently. And Ethan, he didn't become famous, didn't expand, didn't turn his land into something bigger than it needed to be. He just kept farming, the same way he always had. One evening, long after the crowds had stopped coming, he stood at the edge of his field as the sun dropped low behind the trees. The air was cooler now, the ground softer, alive again. He reached down, picking up a handful of soil, letting it fall slowly through his fingers. For a moment, he said nothing. Then almost to himself, "They laughed at you too, didn't they?" There was no answer, just wind moving quietly through the field. But somehow, it didn't feel empty, because the truth was never loud. It didn't stand on stages, didn't come in polished bags with labels and promises. It stayed quiet, buried in the ground, waiting. And maybe that was the part people forgot. That not everything valuable looks impressive at first. That not everything old is weak. And that sometimes, the things we're quickest to dismiss are the very things that last the longest.